Travel back in time with a trip inside the Iowa's News Now vault.
Good evening. I'm Wade Wagner. It was a successful weekend for U.S. trade negotiators in Moscow. Yesterday, the United States and the Soviet Union signed a new long-term grain agreement. A friendly gesture, perhaps, by the Soviets before Mikhail Gorbachev travels to America next week. Mikhail Gorbachev's message to the United Nations December 7th will focus on foreign policy. But the Soviet president will be promoting peace as well as economic cooperation. Specifically, Gorbachev is seeking credits and technical assistance from Europe, Japan, and the United States. So far, his perestroika, or restructuring program, is long on promise and short on performance, still unable to provide a better life for Soviet citizens. The Soviet Union's biggest challenge is food. There isn't enough of it. That's why Mr. Gorbachev is signing grain agreements and turning to places like the state of Iowa for help. The Soviets have a proverb that says the goal of the Russian farmer is to be as productive as the farmer from Iowa. It dates back to Nikita Khrushchev's visit to Coon Rapids, Iowa in 1959.
The Soviets have a very good feeling about Iowa. They all remember Khrushchev visiting the Garst farm at Coon Rapids, and they recognize Iowa as kind of the leading agricultural state in the United States.
The admiration Khrushchev had for Iowa's family farms is now shared by Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. Iowa continues to be an important classroom for Soviet agricultural specialists making field trips to the United States.
They are very readily, receptive to anything that we can offer in terms of technological exchange. Exchange being the key word.
Iowa also enjoys a sister state relationship with Stavropol, an agricultural region near the Black Sea. It's the home of Mikhail Gorbachev. It's also been the site of several trips by Iowans to the USSR. Old Cold War relations are indeed thawing out in the farm fields here and over there. Join me for the next half hour for a return to Russia as we examine the challenges facing Soviet agriculture and the opportunities developing for the U.S. farmer in one of the most mysterious countries of the world. The subways and subway stations are popular stops for foreign tourists in Moscow, especially Americans. These subways carry 8 million passengers a day. Many stations are like mini art museums with murals, sculptures, and paintings. Soviet guides are proud to mention there's no graffiti. They fail to mention Stalin's political prisoners built the underground trains, and many died in the process. While the Soviets still cover up many unpleasant historical events, nosy journalists and even curious tourists are discovering a new Soviet Union. The government's admitting it's not perfect after all. Under Mikhail Gorbachev, it's becoming almost fashionable to talk about the country's social and economic problems. Gorbachev calls it glasnost, or openness.
Today you can see more criticism of managers for their mistakes, for the way they're running their offices and their enterprises. But it's not just criticism for the sake of criticism. It's an attempt to help and analyze their activities and to correct their mistakes.
There's more reporting today about such things as accidents, fires, and court proceedings. At the same time, we're broadcasting more features with an in-depth analysis of what's going on in agriculture and industry.
He's the boss, and whatever he says goes. That doesn't mean that they don't discuss things. He believes in open discussion. He calls it glasnost. But actually, I think that pretty much what he says goes.
50 years ago in the Soviet Union, people were daily executed for thinking what Gorbachev now says.
But this was a Soviet vehicle returning from its first mission of 3.5 hours. Other differences, there was no crew aboard.
The Soviets can send rockets and new shuttles into space, but this is a country that can't produce a decent pair of shoes or enough food for its people. Soviet stores are barely stocked with everyday necessities of life, like furniture and cooking ware. And what you do find is far below worldwide standards in quality and design. A former Soviet citizen says there's no incentive to work hard on the farms or in the factories. The average monthly wage for a Soviet worker is around $250. Alcoholism and absenteeism are major problems.
Many people simply lost the notion how to work hard. Many people simply do not learn how to work hard.
Soviet news programs have focused on corrupt officials and inefficient farms. Creed says it's Gorbachev's attempt to win over the support of the intelligentsia in his country, people like writers and scientists. But Creed says glasnost must extend beyond reports on shoddy workmanship.
If you mean real reformation, real modernization, real progress, you have to, first of all, to free political prisoners. Secondly, to stop this bloodshed in Afghanistan, and then to give people real free enterprise.
Agriculture and food production is a major problem in the Soviet Union. Bob Berglund says if perestroika is to succeed, Gorbachev will have to win the people's support through their stomachs. Berglund headed the USDA at the same time Gorbachev was agricultural minister in the Soviet Union in the late 1970s.
He and I talked about their problems a number of times, and he knew that their attention to large-scale farming was an unmitigated disaster. Big farms, like the Russians organized, simply were too large to manage. And so they had all the decisions made in Moscow, and it was bad. And he knew it, everybody else knew it, but the Russians were too stubborn to change.
He is concerned about the food for the people in that country. They don't have the quality, they don't have the variety, and they don't have enough of it. And that is fundamental in any country in the world. So he cannot avoid that question. That's the main reason why he's concerned about it.
Mr. Gorbachev realizes for his other economic reforms to succeed in other aspects of the economy, other sectors of the economy, one of the first things he has to do is provide the people with stable food supplies to get their support so that he can go on with his other economic reforms.
Before 1917, the Russians exported wheat and other commodities, but the communists phased out private farms and killed millions of peasants. The huge collective and state farms that have evolved have failed miserably.
During Stalin, the farmers that were successful, the individuals, farmers that were successful, were liquidated by Stalin. These were the kulaks. And he chose them as one area in his collectivization of agriculture. He chose them as one area to liquidate in his process of collectivizing agriculture.
Mr. Gorbachev has said he wants more reliance on the private plots, and he wants to put farms on a profit-making basis. He uses the Hungarian model, where in Hungary, even though it's a communist country, those farm managers are allowed to make cropping decisions on the basis of what is best grown on this farm. And the farm managers decide when to harvest, when to plant, what to plant, and control costs and control the whole farm management on the place they run.
Mr. Gorbachev hopes to restore pride back into Soviet agriculture by the use of so-called collective contracts. The contracts allow farm families or groups to lease state-owned farm land.
For instance, in a typical contract, the group of workers will say, we will produce for sale to the farm X tons of wheat, and we will do it on this plot of land, and the farm management will provide fertilizer, chemicals, seed, other inputs as needed for certain prices. And once the collective harvests the output, sells it to the farm, if there's any left over, they can do anything they want with it.
The farmer needs to get paid for the work he does, for his contribution. During these years of stagnation, the farmer didn't get a fair wage. The collective contracts will change that. they'll provide some social justice. Perestroika has improved our lives in just the past 2 years. Under collective contracts, farmers are working harder and more efficiently. They are also getting more joy out of their work.
He lived in Hungary, and he's seen it work in Hungary. And the reason it works in Hungary is because they mix socialism with capitalism. I said the same thing to him, and he said, no, not capitalism, human nature. I said, what's the difference?
The better quality in conjunction with quantity, the more you're going to make, and the harder you work, the more pay you'll get.
Означает ли это, что чем больше вы будете производить, чем лучшего качества, тем больше у вас будет заработок?
Конечно, это и предполагается.
By all means, that's the purpose of all the restructuring.
Это и предполагается этим как раз.
That's the purpose of the restructuring.
But what happens if a group of farmers sign a contract and make a lot of money, and their neighbors continue to work for the state at minimum wage? Chris Foster says it's a case of the haves and have-nots, and it's already creating more than just a little friction in the Soviet countryside.
And many farmers right away are concerned of rich farmers versus themselves, and there's even been cases of sabotage in the country now where farmers not under a collective contract or incentive program are destroying equipment of these other farmers. They don't like the unequal distribution of wealth.
Just now,
Gorbachev's agricultural reforms are welcomed by the director of the Odessa Genetics Institute. He says for too long, beneficial crop research has yielded little returns in the fields.
But if we improve our technology, and if we became not so lazy, we double our agricultural production in nearest years.
The researchers say farmers will now have a reason to nurture crops from planting to market.
We believe that our leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, try all the best to improve our economic life, our agricultural policy.
But many roadblocks are ahead. Even if the Soviet farmer could magically double production tomorrow, it's going to take years to improve the rural infrastructure. Gorbachev will need billions of rubles to pump into that program.
They need the transportation, they need the processing capacity, they need fertilizer manufacturing, they need better machinery, but mainly they need better trained farm managers. They don't have them.
Another potential roadblock, the Soviets' bloated bureaucracy. Regional leaders and party officials are making things difficult for Gorbachev because their jobs are in jeopardy with the new reforms.
There would be resistance on the part of oblast and rayon leaders, farm managers, because what they're doing is they have to give up control to collectives or cooperatives of workers.
We need to fight this huge bureaucratic apparatus. Then the struggle can go forward.
Gorbachev has warned his party comrades he's not backing down, that the country must move forward.
Conservative forces will seize upon any difficulty in a bid to discredit perestroika and provoke dissatisfaction among the people. We should learn to spot, expose, and neutralize the maneuvers of the opponents of perestroika.
In the 1920s, the communist government closed most churches in the Soviet Union. Espousing religious faith here is a bit like agitating for communism in America. It's not illegal, but it won't help your career. Belief is ridiculed in schools as a vestige of feudal superstition. Those who profess their faith risk losing jobs and status. Mostly babushkas, or grandmothers, attend the few churches that are open, but this Russian Orthodox priest says that trend is changing.
Religion is growing very quickly. More students have enrolled in the seminaries and other religious schools. The church has always been for the grandmothers, but now young people are becoming interested in religion.
It's been reported Mr. Gorbachev's mother attends church each week. Perhaps the Soviet leader feels guilty the state denies millions of others the same privilege.
Mr. Gorbachev has had a great influence on the change. We haven't had this much freedom and compassion since 1929. Relations are much better between the church and the state.
Gorbachev insists he's not playing politics with religion. Addressing Soviet religious leaders this summer, Gorbachev delivered a message for the clergy and for outsiders who question his motives.
I must disappoint those who assume that this is a result, that this position is a result of pressure upon us from the West, that we want to please someone, that we are pursuing some hidden motives. No, this too is a result of the new thinking.
I guess I look for a little more openness in Russia in the future than we've had in the past, but I still wouldn't want to let down my guard entirely when dealing with those people in that country.
As Gorbachev has opened up the opportunity for trade through glasnost and perestroika, there's an opportunity for us to sell them grain handling equipment, food processing equipment, and have trade in other areas.
With Gorbachev's farm background, it's making it easier for farm groups to get in than some of the other groups I know from the United States.
The Soviets recently allowed the American Soybean Association to conduct feed trials in the Ukraine. Soviet pigs were fed rations of U.S. soy meal feed and analyzed by American and Soviet researchers.
Once we got their confidence, now they seem very enthused about it. In fact, the results of the trial indicate that we produced about 23% more efficient gain than they were doing on their current rations.
We can grow the feed we need for our livestock, but it doesn't have the right component to be efficient. We've had good success with soy meal and other feed additives from the U.S. I'm sure we'll continue to use it in the future.
Increased livestock and poultry production is the #1 priority for Gorbachev. His country faces chronic shortages of meat. U.S. exporters say he'll need America's help.
Gorbachev told me they would like to increase it from 500 million chickens a year to 3 billion. Now that would require several million tons of additional protein.
They have plans for three crushing plants now to build in Russia to crush more soybeans. So that's a good indication to us that they're in it for the long term. You know, we've had the fortune in the last 2 years to have a person in Russia, you know, traveling in Russia most of the time, not headquartered in Russia, but traveling in there. And he's gotten to the point where he has almost day-to-day access to the agricultural officials in Russia and knows them on a first-name basis. And Gorbachev has promoted their reciprocal action to him. And so we think that speaks very well for our efforts there, and we think it speaks very well for long-term prospects.
The U.S. Feed Grains Council is also expanding its market development activities in the Soviet Union. This protocol agreement extends for 5 years. It will allow Soviet and American trade teams to work together to improve agricultural production in the Soviet Union. The agreement is with Gosagroprom, the Soviet Union's new super ministry for agriculture.
The cupboard's bare over there, and I think that Mr. Gorbachev not only needs more production at home, he'll probably be importing more also. I see that as a continued market for the American farmer.
The Soviet Union is 2.5 times the size of the United States, covering 11 time zones. If it could solve its farm problems and inefficiency, Chris Foster says the Soviets could cut imports. But he doesn't see that happening for 10 to 15 years. The Soviets' cooler and a drier climate will compound the problem.
Even though there is no agreement currently, the Soviets have purchased in just the last few months 6 million tons of U.S. corn, and they're buying soybeans and soy meal.
It's got to be about getting into those value-added markets, meat products, dairy products,
value-added food products. That's where I think that's where the future lies in our trade relationship with the Soviet Union.
Поет американская певица Дайан Уорвик с друзьями Стиви Вандером, Элтоном Джоном и Гладис Найт.
A few U.S. companies have been doing business in the Soviet Union for a long time. Gorbachev is ready to expand those trade relations. One new joint venture called Torg International was formed last month. 51% of the company is owned by American investors. 49% of the company is owned by the Soviet government. Torg International will market Soviet beer, mineral water, wine, and other foods in the United States.
Our partners, and these gentlemen are our partners, not only share the risk with us of marketing and bringing these products to the U.S. market, but also share the profit.
Сделка отвечает интересам и советского, и американского народа.
Of course, this joint venture must have the interest of both the Soviet and the American peoples. This is very significant that the first major trade that we are going to be doing is something as peaceful as soft drinks.
Приходит на американский рынок.
And that these soft drinks, which are truly peaceful in nature, are the first product that will be coming to the United States market.
Dr. Carroll says he hopes to begin importing Soviet goods in May. For now, the company will concentrate on modernizing Soviet plants.
For example, one of our very first products that we'll be bringing over here are Lagidze waters, which are naturally flavored, fruit-flavored mineral waters. Currently, all of the labels are put on by hand. Now, we're talking about thousands and thousands of cases with all labels being put on by hand, so therefore one of our very first machines that we'll be sending over is a labeler.
It is one step more in the development of Soviet-American economic relations.
New individual labor laws are already helping the Soviets' domestic economy. Citizens can now be licensed by the government to do private work for profits. Carpenters and plumbers, for example, can supplement state work by working for a neighbor for extra income. Others have opened up their own businesses called cooperatives. Most of the cooperatives are cafes or restaurants. So far, more than 3,500 cooperatives have opened up for business here in Moscow. The government is taking 10 to 20 applications per day. This Moscow man opened up his own cafe on Gorky Street last spring.
I am free here, yeah. And I am little chief, yeah.
15 young people work with Boris peddling Pepsis and pork sandwiches. Business is so good they can earn up to 3 times the wage of a Soviet school teacher or engineer. The cafe opens at 11 a.m. Business is steady through 11 p.m. The pork sandwiches and the Pepsi are popular among foreign tourists, Soviet shoppers, and even government officials. After all, the Kremlin's located just a stone's throw away from the cafe. It seems everyone likes good, fast food in Moscow. Do you worry about McDonald's coming to Moscow?
I know. There must be 1,000 or 2,000 this style of the cafes in Moscow, because our people must have more places for their fast food. Yeah, now it's very popular food, fast food.
For Boris, Gorbachev is the last hope to resurrect his country's stagnant economy. And Boris says it's a resurrection that shouldn't fall on the government's shoulder. The people, he says, deserve the freedom to help out.
I tell you 3 words, yes. I like him very much. He's very clever man, yeah, and our people waited him too long.
One Pepsi.
One Pepsi, okay. That's one?
I asked for a Pepsi too.
Service with a smile on Gorky Street. One simple gesture behind one small window that's proving perestroika may be heading in the right direction. But for Mikhail Gorbachev and the Soviet people, the road to success is a long one, and the journey has just begun.
В августе 1986 года фирма «Мелодия» выпустила пластинку «Уитни Хьюстон», сохранив обложку оригинала, а в декабре была выпущена аналогичная компакт-кассета. «Уитни Хьюстон» и песня «Внезапно». Тебе трудно, тебя постигло несчастье, не огорчайся, не падай духом. Друзья придут тебе на помощь. Поет американская певица Дайан Уорлик с друзьями.